Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming to the launch session of this year's Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment. Should be pretty obvious from the backdrop, but just in case. So I'm very excited to welcome you to our launch event. This is where we discuss some of the key questions, not just from the APRSA itself, but also to preview some of the potential questions and issues that will be raised during the Shangri-La dialogue that will begin tonight with the keynote address by President Macron. So hopefully we'll have a good set of discussions. We have also friends from the audience who will join us online. So before I introduce my panelists, let me speak a little bit about what APRSA is for those of you who've joined us for the first time. So the Asia-Pacific Regional Security Assessment is our annual strategic dossier that we launch every year at the Shangri-La Dialogue. This is our 12th edition, so we are moving into our second decade. And every year, we make sure that the key contents of the APRSA informs and contextualize some of the key issues and debates raised throughout the Shangri-La Dialogue sessions, as well as the special sessions. Secondly, this year, with APRSA 2025, the dossier was written by 21 IISS experts from all of our 5 offices, and we cover a wide range of issues from defense industrial partnerships, Trump's effort to redefine international security, all the way down to subsea warfare challenges, as well as UAV developments in Southeast Asia. This session is on the record. It is open, so please feel free to raise your questions. Now, unlike in the Shangri-La Dialogue sessions, the way we raise questions here is somewhat manual, so you would have to raise your hands, and I will point to you, and then you can press the mic to speak. But once you go to the SLD sessions, there will be a specific set of instructions on how to do that. So let me briefly introduce my co-panelists. On the far left, we have Ms. Maya Noens, who is the Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Military Policy. On my left, we have Paul Frioli, who is the Senior Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy. On my right, we have Fenella McGurty, who is the Senior Fellow for Defense Economics. And on my far right, we have Veer Pratap Vikram Singh, who is the Research Fellow for Cyber Power and Future Conflict. So the way that I would like to begin this session, this is not your typical academic presentations where everybody speaks about 10 minutes about their papers. We try to make this a bit more conversational. So I would begin by asking a few questions to our panelists. We'll have a discussion, and then at the end, we'll open up the floor for questions. So to all of our speakers and co-panelists, let me begin by asking, which plenary and special sessions do you think attendees should look out for, and why? What do you think are the biggest questions we'll see debated in those sessions? Fenella.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks everyone for having me today. Good afternoon. I hope everyone's well. So I think beyond the wider strategic questions regarding US-China relations and US engagement in the region, which my colleagues are far better placed to discuss, for me as an economist, I think the plenary on ensuring stability in a competitive world will be really interesting and a crucial one as well. In light of the rapidly and indeed frequently shifting goalposts, it's been interesting to see how countries have responded accordingly, how not to exacerbate the instability and ensure that actions are made in a cooperative and cohesive way. I think it's how to engage with other countries in the region, but also allies globally, including those in Europe, that will be very interesting as well. So those discussions that come through. What tools do countries have at their disposal to react and protect themselves from this instability? And I think the big question to come up will be the lasting impact of the shift in the dynamics, with the response to the US's tariff policy and engagement in the region. I think we've already seen a downgrade in regional economic growth, as we have seen globally and in Europe, from the IMF in their latest economic assessment. So what will countries do to respond to stimulate growth? What tools do they have at their disposal? And how might these policies impact competitiveness among countries? Could it foster antagonism and more nationalistic approaches where some countries are more fiscally extended than others? Or will countries' response be united and aim to work together in order to respond and ensure prosperity across the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Vanilla. Paul?
Thank you, Evan, and congratulations on the launch of this year's APRSA. So one theme that I'll be looking for across all of the plenaries and special sessions is to see what the balance will be in discussions regarding traditional defense and security issues and regarding international economic issues. As Vanilla said, the context for the Shangri-La dialogue this year takes place amid huge questions that are being debated inside the US and globally about the role of economic policy in shaping strategies. So this will be, I think, a core issue that in the keynote address, President Emmanuel Macron will discuss. It's the key context, even if it's not the subject of the plenary one addressed by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And it will also, I think, play a major role in the special address by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Going into the special sessions, I think one particularly interesting discussion will occur in Special Session 1, which focuses on defense innovation. Last year, Admiral Samuel Paparo made some sort of remarks that received pickup about the U.S.'s approach to defense innovation, what it's prioritizing, where it sees the defense innovation landscape going in the U.S. So we'll see if we have a repeat of that this year. It'll also be interesting to see in the special sessions whether the India-Pakistan crisis in April and May receives treatment, if there are any official statements coming out of the speakers. There is a special session focused on crisis management mechanisms, and I think one issue where the U.S., Washington became quite concerned with the trajectory of the crisis was in the lack of communication that was observed between India and Pakistan in the midst of the crisis. So that's another issue that I'll be tracking both in the special sessions and throughout the other plenary sessions as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Aprsa?
Thanks, Evan. Just to kind of echo what Paul said, I think Special Session 1 on defense innovations will definitely be an interesting discussion given the changing geopolitical environment. And I think it'll also be a great chaser to the fourth plenary session, which is on cyber, undersea, and outer space defense challenges. Our IISS program looks at cyberspace holistically, which means looking at the virtual, logical, and physical layers, and that includes submarine cables as well as low Earth internet providing satellites. And we've kind of seen over the last 20 years how these malicious cyber activities have become more normalized, and we're starting to see early signs of how how this is unfolding in the undersea and outer space domain. And so there's a great chapter in the APRSA as well by my colleagues Nick Child and Jonathan Bentham on the importance, the strategic significance of undersea infrastructure and its importance. And coming back to the questions that I'm hoping that I'm looking at, as well as I think we should all be looking at, how are small and middle states going to be responding to this expanding threat environment, where the threats to cyberspace can come not only from online, but also from physical infrastructure, as well as what is this going to mean for our collective appreciation for cyberspace when this infrastructure is seen as legitimate targets by some states, and then for the Asia Pacific more specifically, and bringing it back to the APRSA chapter that I've co-authored, how are political and defense leaders going to be looking at these problems, because this is the type of environment where reactive solutions are going to be short-term solutions, and so I'd be interested to see how they plan on approaching these with a long-term perspective in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. May?
Thanks very much, Evan. And probably no surprises from me here. I'll be really looking forward to how, across all of the different plenary sessions and simultaneous special sessions, China is viewed by countries in this region in this year, after a year of quite substantial, I think, assertiveness and indeed also engagement by the PRC across Southeast Asia and beyond. What is that perceived as? How are countries responding to that? But that also brings me, of course, to plenary session 1, where I think a lot of countries and members of the audience will be looking forward to hearing from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, as well with regards to the U.S.'s policy towards the Indo-Pacific at the moment, whether that ambition remains the same. The title for the plenary session is indeed U.S. New Ambitions for the Indo-Pacific and its security. So indeed, what is new here and what maintains, what remains as it has been the last few years? What can we expect? And lastly, I don't think anyone's mentioned it yet, but plenary session 3, I think, is noteworthy, and it'll focus on managing proliferation risks in the Asia-Pacific. This is a time of greater instability in the region. Countries are, I think, looking forward to greater mechanisms for cooperation, for engagement, in order to sustain that and strengthen that stability. But at the same time, there are real risks here. And I think none of us will be surprised if concerns around nuclear are becoming more prominent. So I think that will be a really important session for us all to pay attention to.
Thank you, Mayor. Before I go to my next set of questions, let me first say to those of you joining us online, if you would like to put or write down your questions, particularly those joining from Zoom, if you would like to write down your questions at the chat box, please do so now, and then I'll try to read them after we get through our few rounds of discussion. I should also note again that all of the 4 speakers here and my co-panelists are also key authors of the specific chapters that you all have read at APRSA this year, so we can have more discussions about specific points that they wrote on those chapters. So back to you, Fenella. Obviously, with the keynote address tonight by President Macron, France will talk about its new or revised Indo-Pacific strategy, which will include a set of defense industrial partnerships across the region in the Asia-Pacific, particularly in Southeast Asia. Could you maybe talk a little bit, drawing from your APRSA chapter, about what you think made France and perhaps other European countries a strong defense industrial partner for the region? Is it offset? Is it something else? Fenella.
Thanks, Evan. So to give a bit of background on my contribution to the dossier, my team in London looked at European defense industrial engagement and partnerships in Southeast Asia specifically. We have found that activity has strengthened in recent years. Obviously, European companies like Airbus, Damen Naval Group, and Thales have had a long-standing presence in the region, spanning several decades, and other European actors have entered the market in more recent years as well, not least Italy's Fincantieri or Sweden's Saab as well. And countries in the region have pursued industrial policies to foster greater investment in their domestic industrial bases, through foreign entities, through the procurement process as well. And while the Southeast Asia defense market is relatively small in defense spending terms, the combined spending of the largest markets in Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, came to just under $51 billion last year, which is just under Japan's defense budget annually. And I think, what's crucial to note is that growth has really accelerated in this region over the last 2 years. And if you focus just on defense investments, so that is funding on procurement and R&D, that has seen a significant growth as well. We've seen spending here grow from $7.8 billion in 2022 to $10.5 billion last year, and it is on track to exceed $11 billion this year. So there's significant amounts of money here, and there are recapitalization programs being pursued. The average allocation within defense budgets towards investment has increased as well, which is a trend that we're seeing in Europe as well, as countries modernize and recapitalize. So 10 years ago, countries in Southeast Asia were allocating on average 15.7% of the defense budget towards investment, and now we're exceeding 21%, and that share looks to increase again in 2025. So it's that increase in funding, but also the increase directed towards programs. I think what we're seeing is significant increases in countries like Indonesia and Singapore, and now Philippines, as the countries are pursuing modernization programs. Singapore is also looking at, with the recent growth there, trying to kind of catch up on critical projects that were perhaps delayed by the pandemic, but also investing in digitalization and non-kinetic capabilities. And the Philippines last year approved a $35 billion program to upgrade its military forces. So we will see marked growth coming through. It's persistent, as is characteristic of Asia generally. So small and scope for further growth. If you consider these countries on average allocate 1.5% of GDP to defense, which does mask some variation across the countries, there is scope to increase that proportionally as well. So yes, as I say, countries are pursuing clear industrial strategies to develop their industrial bases. Most countries have some form of formal offset policy, and if it's not formal, then within the procurement process, there are usually stipulations that procurement does help the defense industrial base, that there is some element of local participation. And I think as policies have adapted and strengthened, European companies have also adapted. They've adapted their proposals and their offerings to accommodate these wider offset or local industrial participation requirements. France, in particular, has been very good at engaging with Southeast Asia. We've just seen the agreement between France and Asia for future defense engagement, and that follows a series of successful contracts between the two countries in recent years. Rafales, long-range air surveillance radars from Thales, 2 Scorpion submarines, the latter involving domestic production as well. So that's what's coming through. And I'll just close by saying that such engagements, they've enabled countries to develop various domestic capabilities and strengthen the partnerships between European entities and companies within the countries themselves. I think the regional preference to avoid dependence on a small number of suppliers presents that key risk, I suppose, in the region where you are seeing increased competitiveness as well. So external market entrants, Israel and Turkey, but also internally within the wider region. So South Korea and Japan have stepped up engagements as well, and obviously US firms continue to have a strong presence in the region. So it's growing, but heavily and increasingly contested as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Fenella. Paul, if I can return to you, tomorrow morning we will hear Secretary Hegseth's first major speech in the region. What should be the key issues that we should be looking out for? How do you think the direction of defense policy now sort of fit within President Trump's broader foreign policy vision, something which you wrote about in your chapter? Paul?
Great, thanks, Evan. As you mentioned, this will be the Trump administration's first detailed policy statement on its stance toward the Asia-Pacific. Throughout the campaign and really through his second time in office thus far, there haven't been a lot of details on offer in terms of how operationally the U.S. approach in the region is going to change and what the priorities will be. So, as best as I can tell, it seems as though there will be a major emphasis on taking steps to deter China, and also the sort of topic, which I think will receive some attention tomorrow from Secretary Hegseth, is the idea of shifting the balance in terms of allied burden sharing. So those are, I think, 2 tent poles on which the speech will hang. Although I would say, if you look at those two goals, both of those depend on sort of inducing outside countries to act in ways that the U.S. would wish them to act. The real question, though, is how is the U.S. going to kind of put the pieces in place in order to make that happen? What will the U.S. do? What will it prioritize? What will it spend money on? What will it not spend money on? I think those are major questions that the region is wondering about. We'll see how many details are on offer tomorrow. I think one characteristic of this administration's approach to policymaking generally, but also in particular on kind of security and defense issues in relation to foreign policy, which is kind of the topic that Evan charged us with in the chapter that we worked on. He said, will the Trump administration be known most of all for its domestic policy or for its foreign policy. So I had to sort of think about, and this is before the administration was even in office, so I thought, okay, how do we think about this question? You can look at the first Trump administration and see how things played out during that time. You can see what the campaign statements are, and then you can see operationally, how does Trump convene a team, how do they work together, how operationally do things work? I think one key factor to keep in mind when you're trying to sort of interpret why is the US acting in the way it is, why is the Trump administration behaving the way it does, I think a distinctive thing about it is that Donald Trump himself has distinctive views about foreign policy that go back decades. So when he was, a kind of 40-year-old real estate developer, he paid quite a large sum of money to post, kind of a one-page advertisement in the New York Times, in the Boston Globe, and in the Washington Post, describing his views on allied burden sharing, on trade, trade deficits. They're all the same views that he articulated during the campaign and has now articulated well in office. So I think on a couple of issues, there's immigration, as I said, there's trade, there's allied burden sharing. You can make a short list of things where he's been saying the same thing for many decades. I think those are areas where he has fixed views and they're hard to dislodge him from. On a lot of the other issues, he can convene a team of people, as he has at the Pentagon, with the top 3 officials who have views where they really do disagree with each other, and they have running room to kind of to sort of make policy in those areas. And if it doesn't bump up against a core Trump conviction, then they probably will be able to make some headway in those areas. So we'll see in the speech tomorrow, perhaps what is the tone and what are the details operationally that Secretary Hegseth is able to offer. In terms of the reactions to his speech, one interesting facet of attending SLD and watching the plenaries is you can see in real time the sort of speakers reacting to each other, both in terms of the tone and the content of their speech. So it'll be interesting to track regional reactions to the speech, particularly when it comes to the topic of allied burden sharing. I mean, the general context, as I said earlier, for the speech is that there's sort of an unprecedented level of uncertainty about the U.S.'s approach toward international economic policy, with the reciprocal tariffs considered against major trading powers in the region, including Vietnam and others, would be hugely consequential if they were to go forward. So seeing the regional reaction to the potential for a kind of economic unwinding, it will be interesting to track. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And certainly with the U.S.-China dynamic being so prominent, that's certainly a key point for us to be looking forward to. But let me turn to Maya now. While the conversation has certainly revolved around the U.S.-China dynamics, not just this year, but in previous years as well as throughout the Shangri-La dialogues, you and your co-author of the APRSA chapter have actually made a strong case for why we should also be considering Japan's sort of broader strategic interests and outlook, particularly when it comes to their concern over the growing ties between China, Russia, and North Korea. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Thanks, Evan. And you're right. I mean, U.S.-China relations do dominate the news, are factored into almost every topic that we discuss these days, but there are, of course, other aspects of Chinese foreign policy that are important to consider when we think about regional security dynamics. And here, I think none could be more important than what's currently unfolding in the triangular relationship, I should say, between China, North Korea, and Russia. It's not new triangular relationship, but I think there is a new momentum perhaps behind some of the dyads within this triangular relationship that do present its own challenges. Firstly, I think it is important to note that this relationship between the 3 countries, Russia, China, and North Korea, is complex. It is not straightforward. It is triangular and not trilateral in nature. So we're not talking yet about a minilateral in the sense that we would see between the United States and others, or between countries in Southeast Asia and others yet between the 3 countries. I would say that it is triangular in nature and has, of course, those 3 different components, each in their own right. There are tensions that underlie this relationship that mean that the relationship isn't perfect, isn't fully aligned equally across these dyads. And that, of course, also is interesting to watch. But there are elements of movement, I think, that are important. To date, we haven't necessarily seen it evolve yet into something pragmatic between the three countries. There's only been one suggestion so far by the DPRK of a trilateral naval exercise, and that hasn't yet happened. And nevertheless, despite all of this uncertainty perhaps in this triangular formation, there is potential for this relationship to be destabilizing in its own right. There are obviously drivers behind these various dyads that these countries think serve their interests, whether in bilateral formations within the triangular relationship or in a triangular format in and of itself. There is, I think, a common interest here in terms of creating perhaps instability. There's interest in a different world order that the three countries share. And that, of course, for neighboring countries like Japan, I think, is very much on the radar, not least because of the developments themselves, but also, of course, how this might unfold further in the event of a potential crisis or conflict in the region. Countries like Japan now no longer have to just look at one element of this triangular relationship, but perhaps a combination of various different factors that might culminate and prove even more challenging at the end of the day. For countries like Japan, as we've written in our chapter together with my colleagues Eric Green and Junpei Ishimaru, we looked at whether or not, first of all, this necessarily changes Japan's trajectory in security and defense, and second of all, what else could be done. And here, two things stand out for us. Firstly, the developments in this triangular relationship don't necessarily mean that Japan has to change how it invests in defense at the moment. Instead, we judge that Japan instead just needs more of it, more of what it's already doing. And that means investing more in integrated air and missile defense, investing more in anti-submarine warfare capabilities, investing more in long-range strike, and indeed expanding its reserve force and expanding its magazine depth. Second of all, it also has been interesting to see how Japan itself is positioning its relationship with a different triangular formation, and that is with China and South Korea when it comes to instability on the Korean Peninsula. And here, it's been interesting to see how Japan has sought to try and find some sort of common ground on some of these issues with the PRC moving forward. For example, in May 2024, there was the 9th Japan, China, and South Korea trilateral summit. This was deemed somewhat symbolic, and yet still on the menu of conversation topics was Korean Peninsula stability. And this was then also further deepened and expanded through a suggested and held foreign ministers meeting in March 2025. So maybe just to conclude, I think this is an area, again, if we think about proliferation risks, if we think about instability in the region, cannot just see this through the US-China lens. There are other dynamics that are happening and that are at play, and that will be important to watch.
Thank you, Maya. Speaking of Japan, I should say that our Japan chair, Robert Ward, has also recently published and launched his Japan Adelphi on Japan's new defense strategy. So I encourage you to go to our website and maybe ask him for a signed copy after the session. Let me turn to Virpratap now. As you wrote on your chapter, militaries around the region are boosting their modernization efforts amidst geopolitical uncertainties, including their attempt to mature their cyber military forces, which, as you say, kind of ties in very closely to the key debates and question at the special sessions tomorrow on defense in the outer space and cyberspace. So could you speak more about those challenges that militaries around the region face as they seek to mature their cyber military forces?
Absolutely. Thanks, Evan. Within the Asia-Pacific, my co-author, Maureen Urahil, and I looked at around 11 territories that have established, elevated, or restructured their military cyber forces since 2017. To kind of get straight to the challenges that we identified, I think The first is fairly firmly centered on whether political and military leaders will support such efforts and the conditions that these leaders might create for changes to take place. Cyber has an unfortunate, or I should say maybe fortunate reputation of not being as tangible as some of our other contemporary security threats. It's a lot easier to be worried about a warship on the horizon than it is about the threats in your network. And to kind of use a regional example, in late 2024, the former Indonesian president announced that Indonesia would be establishing a new cyber force, a move that was quietly walked back by the new administration shortly after its inauguration. But then, as we saw in March of 2025, Indonesia has expanded its military's responsibilities in protecting cyberspace, and yet there's been very little response on whether a cyber force is going to take place. You know, this creates a considerable set of challenges because political support is essential for securing funding, as some of my colleagues have mentioned. And you know, many countries in the regions have already been involved in multi-year modernization efforts. And so to be able to make that case to your political leaders, to your military leaders, to either reallocate funding or to secure additional funding from legislators is not only difficult, but also incredibly necessary when looking at the establishment of cyber forces. I think a second challenge, and this is much more reflective of the key differences in the security environment in the Asia-Pacific as opposed to that of Europe and North America, is that there's a need to kind of really set out the strategies and the doctrines that can clearly set out what the mission is. These are really important because I think they help inform countries on how you want to go about this. And you know, you can start with very basic questions. What do you consider as cyberspace? That answer can change quite noticeably as you go across the region. And you can quickly advance from there. Which networks are your military cyber forces going to defend? Are these forces permitted to conduct offensive cyber operations? Are they permitted to conduct information operations? You know, we've seen developments in Japan where they've passed their active cyber bill, where they're starting to approach these questions, but there's still a gap that needs to be bridged. And these questions are important because they not only inform how these forces will operate independently, but also how they will operate with existing forces, existing military forces, as well as civilian agencies, and with international partners and existing alliances and military partnerships. Finally, I think there's a real challenge for Asia-Pacific states to kind of keep up with the landscape. As mentioned, you know, we've got this plenary session on cyberspace, on cyber outer space and undersea. I've messed up the order there, but you know, looking at some of the changes, you know, the Philippines has elevated its cyber group to a cyber command last October. But you know, as we're considering a more multi-domain environment, you need to really start looking at the directions that these threats can come from, especially if cyberspace can be affected by undersea disruptions or disruptions from space. That changes how you need to be able to respond to this. And it's important to kind of keep in mind that these changes take time, not only for securing talents and tools, but also in becoming operational. India announced that it was going to establish its defense cyber agency in 2018, and it took more than 3 years for it to become operational in 2021. And it was only last year that they actually were able to publish a joint doctrine for cyber operations. And so, you know, again, it's reflective of the amount of time that these changes take to make. And if we're looking at these increasingly tense geopolitical environments, that window for maneuverability and for change is shortening. And you know, too many countries, I think, are content with being reactive. So to summarize, you know, the challenge is that they need political and military leadership to support them. They need to better define their scope, and they need to keep pace with this changing environment. Cyberspace is unfortunately one of those domains where misperceptions can really significantly contribute to escalation. So thinking through these maturity questions is quite critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratap. I think all of the speakers have touched on various key points from their chapter, but also sort of some of the key debates and questions that we hope to see tonight, as well as the next few days throughout the dialogue. So let me now speak a little bit about how we're going to do this. So I'll ask again to our audience at Zoom if you could put your questions to the chat box. And in the meantime, let me open the floor to questions. I'll take 3 questions this round first. I'll have a chance for the speakers to respond, and then we'll go for another round. Any questions from the floor? Henry.
Question. Sorry, on the microphone properly. Pratap, you mentioned in your summary there the links between civil and military cyber capabilities. I wondered if you had, from your research on that chapter, any thoughts about what factors have influenced how regional states decide where to place the balance of investment or the balance of cyber capability in between military or non-military parts of government, and whether that was there was some kind of consistent trends across the region, or there were just different individual local factors with a prime influence there.
Thank you. Anybody else? No, maybe Pratap, if you want to answer first.
Sure. Henry, I don't have any specific figures, but I will say that what we're able to see is that a lot of these responses and changes are slightly more reactionary. So, Asia-Pacific states have done a great job in terms of setting up these civilian cyber defense agencies. These are, of course, especially important given how broad the threats to cyberspace are and the scope of impact that incidents can have. And I think one of the issues is that when a big incident happens, these civil agencies are sometimes not in a position to defend against them, which can sometimes kind of raise these questions of, well, why don't we get the military involved? So, that is definitely one of the challenges that we face, that we notice in the region. Yeah.
So let me read some of these questions. Vanilla, I think this one is for you. As ASEAN navigates evolving strategic challenges and Europe assumes a more prominent role in regional security dialogues, how do you foresee these geopolitical shifts influencing capital market flows and financial stability across the region? For Paul, I think this one is for you. From Gregory, given recent U.S. strategic shifts towards the Middle East and budgetary pressures at the Pentagon, what specific assurances or actions should Indo-Pacific allies expect from Washington to sustain credible deterrence against regional security threats, especially in the Korean Peninsula and the South China Sea? Lastly, Maya, maybe this one is for you from Ferdus. How are U.S. tariffs or trade wars affecting war in Europe? Yeah, I think that was a sharp but also pretty complicated set of questions. Let me start with Vanilla first.
Thanks, Evan, and thank you for the question. So in terms of the capital market flows into Asia and the impact of tariffs and kind of the fallout, I think we are seeing it start to create issues in terms of financial stability, not just in Asia, also in Europe, as the difficulties come through in terms of not just the policies themselves, but the stability or certainty with which they're enacted also takes an issue as well. And I think, as I say, we did see a downgrade of regional growth from 5% last year to 4.5% this year. It's still strong, still enviable in terms of European standards as well. But there still does have that impact, and it's how fast and effective countries are able to respond and whether they have the bandwidth to do so. And if I can just bring in that final question as well and just add a few thoughts in terms of the impact on Europe, because there are parallels, there are similarities. You are seeing the downgrade of German economic growth as well. And obviously we've seen moves by Germany to bolster defense investment in recent months in order to finance ongoing military capabilities, to bolster financing. And it's actually taking a more leading role in Europe. So that downgrade in economic growth and therefore the impact on government revenues and future investment will have the impact, and it creates the squeeze elsewhere. So it's the impact that it's going to have on countries that are able to continue funding increases for defense. Because in Asia, obviously, we've seen growth led by sort of Japan and South Korea in recent years, now Australia. But as that feeds through, it just creates more and more issues, and it's the same kind of feeling in Europe as well. And it creates a bit of difficulty in terms of being able to work together and to not retreat to sort of nationalistic priorities as well. I think what we're seeing in Europe is trying to be a bit more of a united approach and looking at new and creative ways of funding defence as well, which we might see increasingly in Asia emerge as well. So in terms of utilising the private sector or bringing in new, more creative ways of using the private banks and really the role that governments play in fostering that investment in defence as well. So it creates these ramifications through. So it's not just the immediate impact in terms of economic growth, it's therefore the impact on your long-term plans for defence and how you're able to fund it and the impact that that's going to have on other aspects of public spending.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, to Gregory's question, which I think reflects the kind of nature of the international system at the moment, where the U.S. is attempting, the declared policy of the U.S. is to sort of pivot from Europe to the Asia Pacific. But meanwhile, I think if you just look at how the Trump administration has used the time that it's had in office so far in terms of where it's dedicated most attention, a lot of that attention has gone to its international trade agenda. A lot of attention has gone to Europe to find some sort of resolution or ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war. It has gone to the Middle East for much of the time, both because of the crisis in Gaza, but also now there's a sort of nuclear negotiations underway with Iran. Meanwhile, the pivot to Asia is still a declared policy, but there hasn't been a sort of major detailed speech by administration official describing the Asia policy. I think the National Defense Strategy, which will put some details down on paper, is not due out until September at the earliest. But so how can the U.S. remain a sort of credible, a credible force and partner for allies in the Asia Pacific? I mean, that's a major question. I think one issue that is ongoing at the moment that comes to the top of mind is the issue of nuclear proliferation in the region, with China's huge investment in increasing the size of its arsenal. That's something that the U.S. will have to bear in mind as it navigates allied relationships and whether extended deterrence will remain in place in the way that it has been. An issue in the U.S. system organizationally is how can the kind of organization and bureaucracy of the U.S. government cope with all of these challenges at one time. So we see that there's been a huge downsizing on the National Security Council. We have our Secretary of State as doing dual duty as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. So I think there is a scarcity of attention in Washington, where there is a kind of limit to how many crises the government can deal with at once. So these will all be live issues as the Trump administration gets its Asia-Pacific diplomacy underway over the next 6 months.
Thank you. Maya?
Oh, I think Fenella already answered that question expertly. Thanks.
Thank you. Karima?
I had a question for Fenella as well. So you've mentioned the role of European companies in becoming important suppliers for partners in Asia. As Europe steps up its own defense and the discourse about strategic autonomy, keeping the US out, How do you think that'll impact what is available for partners around the world, impacts on supply chain? Where does that leave, the rest of us here? Particularly because this it seems like the Trump administration will also ask partners and allies to do more. So the demand in the region is only going to grow. How do we fill that? I was wondering if you've thought about those questions or covered in your chapter. Thank you.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Yeah, thank you. I had exactly the same question actually as Garima, but I have a follow-up question as well. Reversely, have you studied how some Asian countries, such as South Korea, can actually contribute to the European effort to build their own kind of industrial base? Because as we see, South Korea is a major equipment provider to Poland and Estonia so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Wang Dong?
Thank you, Evan. I would like to call attention to, I think, a very important statement President Trump made after China and the United States made substantial progress in their trade negotiation in Geneva. I think in the press conference afterwards, Trump actually said the deal was good, was very good. It was good for the United States, was good for China, and it was good for unification and peace. And nobly, I think Trump said that in the context referring to the fact that the United States is making a deal with China. And there's been a lot of debates to what exactly he meant. And my understanding is that apparently he referred to the peaceful unification between Chinese mainland and Taiwan. And apparently I think his statement already has dealt a blow to the pro-independent forces in Taiwan. And I think we probably should not pretend that Trump has not made that such a statement. Indeed, I would argue this is a very significant statement. And indeed, it fits a pattern of growing voices in recent years in the strategic circles in the United States. I think increasingly number of, we've seen quite a number of prominent U.S. strategists, including Tom Christensen, Bonnie Glaser, Oriana Alshura, etc. They actually argue that the U.S. policy toward Taiwan should not single-handedly be built on this concept of deterrence. They actually argue that peaceful unification should not be excluded. The United States should not flatly reject that. So I think I would like to direct this question maybe to Paul, since you are the lead author of this chapter. So can you foresee a scenario where Trump actually publicly support peaceful unification between Chinese mainland and Taiwan? And if so, how will it look like? I'll be very interested in knowing your interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add on that question on Taiwan, because we have a question from Lionel at Webster University, Geneva, and maybe Maya, this one is for you. Aside from the broader U.S. policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, what do you anticipate in terms of the triangular, and this goes to your chapter perhaps, in terms of the triangular relationship between Taipei, Washington, and Beijing moving forward? So we have a question for Fernella on defense industry, Paul on Trump, and Maya on Taiwan. Maya, do you want to start first?
Thank you. Look, I think I'm going to start first on responding to your question, Professor Wong, and we've known each other a long time, so thanks for your point. I don't think I would read that statement the same way as you did, but you're right that he said those words, and President Trump did use the word unification, and that is often interpreted in a certain way. I think the State Department walked back that statement actually since then. So I don't know if I would presume that it was meant in that precise way as you describe. With regards to the the triangular relationship between Taipei, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. moving forward, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think from what I'm seeing so far, I don't necessarily see a closening of relations between those three partners in a triangular sense. Instead, what I see Taipei doing is proposing ways, as other partners and allies might be doing, in terms of burden sharing, to show commitment to its own capacity building and investment in its bilateral relationship with Washington, D.C., with the U.S. through economic terms, for example. And I don't necessarily see the relationship with Beijing changing all that much at the moment, despite the positive talks that came out of Geneva. So for me, there's more continuity and less change than the question might suggest.
Thank you. Paul?
Yeah, I agree with Maya's perspective and would really only add that, while continuity certainly dominates in terms of U.S. policy and official positions, I'd say, the U.S. position remains ambiguous on the question. Perhaps rhetorically, Trump's statements are more ambiguous than Biden's were. Biden seemed to be going in a slightly less ambiguous direction, but I think, in some sense, the Trump administration is a sort of return to form in how the administration approaches questions related to Taiwan.
Thank you. No?
Thanks, Evan, and thanks for the questions. I think, in terms of the role that European companies play in the region, especially as Europe steps up its own defense, so what's available for partners, I think, obviously, and sort of a shameless self-plug here, but we have just published a paper called Defending Europe, and it's looked at these issues where in Europe, the increase of, you can in theory increase funding, you can find different ways, increase debt levels, you make use of the national escape clause from the EU and bear the brunt of the cost over a long period of time. But it's the effectiveness of how that spending is then enacted and whether European industry is able to respond at speed and at scale. And certainly over the last 2 years, we've seen companies across the region make those investments because they are seeing a bit more in terms of security of demand from governments. Arguably, there needs to be more long-term planning, more long-term contracts, so that there can be more investment with confidence. But we have seen an increase in the level of output of production across Europe. So there is some response coming through. Unfortunately, it didn't happen 10 years ago. It's just in the last 2 years that it's really stepped up in terms of the tempo and activity. And that did create some level of competition and duplication across Europe because funding increased at the same time for the same resources, for the same replenishment of similar stocks. So I think the moves in Europe to create more of a cooperative arrangement, to look at joint procurement, to try and avoid competing with each other has started to take effect as well. And I think what's been really interesting is to see, even though Europe has these challenges and is facing, obviously, difficulties regionally, there's still been that increasingly or concerted effort to maintain that engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. It's still there in industrial and or defense strategies. It's still coming through. We've seen a raft of defense agreements come through in the last few months, even so Germany engaging more in the region, and obviously France still playing a strong role in terms of defense industrial partnerships, and even the UK, which is where things are very fiscally constrained, and the SDR is ongoing and it's still navigating how to marry major procurement programs with a very tight equipment budget. And as countries are looking to maybe get to that 3.5% of GDP plus 1.5 on defense plus or defense support funding, whatever you include in your calculation, it's how that funding is then deployed. But as I say, I think the level of commitment from these countries to the region has been really interesting because it would have been very tempting in some ways to retreat and to ensure your domestic industry is supported. But I think there's definite recognition of the benefits to European industry as well. And it's been really interesting to see these sort of new European market entrants and the rise of South Korea in terms of defense procurement in the region, and it's really up to Europe to step up and compete as well, because obviously we saw South Korean entities able to respond at pace, at scale, and offer funding arrangements as well. So just a very compelling competitor within the region, and also now increasingly within the Asia region as well. So yeah, I think it's something definitely of concern, but I think it's interesting that Europe is, countries in Europe are still trying to show the level of engagement in the region, and we have seen procurement contracts come through. The UK is recommitted to GCAP, recommitted to AUKUS, and try to ensure that those programs continue, even though things are very fiscally constrained. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in the back, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask about, first of all, about China. As we all know, the Shangri-La dialogue is very important, venue to communicate and have a dialogue with not only the U.S. and the partner and ally, but China as well. But the Chinese defense minister has decided not to attend and join here. And also, even though China will send a kind of delegate, but they skipped the important dialogue with the Secretary Hexas, bilateral meeting with the U.S. So as the main, organizer of the Shangri-La dialogue, what do you think, and what is the assessment of the Chinese decision, and are you concerned? And what is the assessment of this kind of China's decision? Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, I should just say that as in previous years, the IISS has invited China to attend the Shangri-La dialogue at the most senior levels to enable China to participate fully in its deliberations. The Institute, however, does not comment on the detailed composition of national delegations. Such questions should be addressed to the respective capitals. Thank you. Kang Vu?
Hi, I'm Kang. I'm a researcher at Boston College covering Vietnam and the Korean Peninsula. So I have a quick question about the role of the U.S. and especially the role of the PLA in the context of the great power competition. So as one of the themes that I see in the entire conversation this morning and this afternoon is that we all agree the U.S. is declining, and we are kind of really worried about the role of the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific security. So what I'm asking here is that we are entering the stage where the U.S. is really unwilling to lead, and also China is not yet able to step up. So I think there is a question that needs to be addressed is that what kind of role that the Chinese military or the Chinese military growth can play in stabilizing the region, because right now we tend to treat the U.S. as a stabilizer, but as we see the past few months or so, like a lot of countries saying like U.S. is here to extract rand, not to actually protect the Indo-Pacific. But for China now, I think there is a serious question to think about, like the PLA can become a force of peace for the region. So I'm curious about like how do you address that kind of possibility of respect in your regional security assessment? Thank you.
Thank you. Emily?
Yes. All right. My question is for Virpatav, actually. So in your research about the creation of cyber command and cyber forces in different countries, do you also see cross-country differences or the similarities given of the reason given by the security forces as to why a cyber command or cyber forces is necessary for their respective country? And how does that reasoning may or may not contribute to the political buy-in and the public awareness and public sentiment about the formation of such cyber security forces? I'm just asking because in Thailand, the Supreme Commander have kind of bounced the idea of having cyber command forces and also cyber academy, and got pretty harsh public backlash, and by that extension, the parliament kind of rolled back on their interest on the cyber command forces. So just kind of want to get your take on it. Thanks.
Thank you. Lastly, Riho?
Thank you very much. I'm Riho Aizawa from Japan. Out of my curiosity, so why Chapter 3 in this assessment focuses impact on the adversarial cooperation among the three on Japan, not ROK and other regional countries. And are there any impacts of the cooperation among the three on other regional countries we have to pay attention to? And how we should deal with the adversarial cooperation? Because we young leaders, we're talking about promoting deterrence by presence within regional countries by expanding mutual presence. So I'm curious about your ideas. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Virpata?
Thank you. There definitely are differences amongst the different countries. You mentioned Thailand. That's definitely an interesting example because I think they even moved to the discussing procurement of like the systems that they might be using. The reasons for it I think are reflective of the threat environment that the Asia Pacific faces. For the Philippines, they've since they started their transparency initiative in the maritime domain, there's been a lot of increased cyber activity that they've faced originating from China, and so there's definitely been an increased need for them to respond in that domain. So that's more than likely the reason why they've expanded in that domain. Additionally, with Indonesia, it was part of their policy conversations for a while, but I think I certainly feel that the ransomware incident from summer of last year definitely galvanized the efforts. Those reacting to those incidents definitely brings political buy-in because the shock value is higher. It's easier to get the public to buy into why some of these steps might be necessary. After all, national security tends to be a very valid reason for a lot of a lot of populations to kind of agree to certain defense changes. That being said, it shouldn't be understated that that some of these developments need to be better planned out, and I think that's also reflective in how the history of the defense establishment in these countries varies considerably, and so there's definitely a lot of conversations that should happen between civil society and governments and militaries when building these things out. That's why I brought up that question of like, what exactly do you mean by cyberspace? How do you want to defend it? Because those can have really far-reaching consequences that can have much larger impact.
Thank you. May I think the question for China stepping up as well as Japan?
Sure. On the first question, I think I would question your premise firstly a little bit about whether or not the U.S. is so firmly in decline as you mentioned in your question, and I think we'll see tomorrow what the result is of Secretary of Defense Hegseth's speech. That maybe might give us a bit more of a clue as to what the commitments to the region remain or might be moving forward. But can China be a stabilizer in this region? I can't speak for other countries, but I'm sure that most people would love to see China be a force for peace in this region. China has come out with, a few years ago, a global security initiative. I think so far we haven't seen much flesh on the bone yet of what that actually means in practice and moves towards that in practical terms. So for now, it's more still of a vision and a concept. But on the other hand, I would also question and say, well, there are initiatives that China has undertaken and conversations that China is having with other countries in this part of the world that have not necessarily progressed as much, even if the United States isn't part of them. Think, for example, of the Code of Conduct conversations, and I'm sure Evan, our senior fellow for Southeast Asian security and defense, will be able to speak more on that point as well in the sidelines if you're interested. So is it an opportunity? Sure, but it would be one for China to take at the end of the day. Second of all, why did the chapter focus on the implications for Japan and not South Korea? I think first and foremostly, we have a very excellent Japan Chair program at the Institute, so Japan is of key interest to the IISS. It's a country that has formidable, I think, implications for the rest of the region and has made some significant changes in terms of its security policies in recent years. And so for that reason, it is interesting to look at how it is responding to this triangular relationship. But you're absolutely right. There are other countries and other regions, indeed, of which could be on the receiving end of implications from this triangular relationship. We could have, of course, talked about the ROK. We'd have also, of course, talked about Europe and how Europe is currently experiencing implications from both North Korea's support of Russia's war effort and China's economic support of Russia as well. Yes, there are multiple dynamics at play here, but the chapter can only be so long, otherwise we'd have to write the whole book as one chapter. And lastly, what else can be done from a young leader's perspective? I think this is an area where we all look forward to hearing your ideas, but the chapter does talk a little bit more about not just Japan's response in and of itself or its relationship with the United States. It is, of course, interesting to see how Japan is also multilateralizing its defense engagement and security relationships with various different partners in the Indo-Pacific and diversifying those. And that, I think, is something that we will see continue. Thanks.
Thank you. I saw Robert.
Thank you. I'm Robert from the Philippines. My question is specifically addressed to the authors of the first chapter. Recently, we've seen a trend where certain states are becoming more and more conservative about the export and import of raw and processed critical minerals. Now, considering China's dominance in the global critical minerals market, my question is, what do you think are the short-term and long-term effects of this, especially in the context of defense industrial partnerships? And how do you think countries can mitigate the risk of China's unpredictable practice of trade control over critical minerals? Thank you.
Thank you. Him?
Thank you, Evan, for giving me the floor. My name is Him Dasmay, Executive Director of the Cambodian Center for Regional Study. Congratulations to the IISS team for this wonderful publication, particularly Evan and all the contributors. I have like 10 questions from that book, but I scoped down to 3. The most pressing one, and I think many people in the room also want to know. Number one, will you please help me answer whether or not we will see more security alliance? It's just that we don't call it formal treaty alliance in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in South Asia, in your view. Number two, how the enhancing defense capacity in defense industry are very important in this critical juncture, with many flashpoints available. But should there be discussion also on way to promote like regional arms control or international arms control through a binding treaty that major countries like US and China should start talking about on that front. And the third one that I want to know from all of you, very, very expert in security architecture in the region, how you see China place in the regional security architecture, how to make sure that China also has a role, so that the regional order more stable and less prone to risk of conflicts. So I would like to seek your view on this question.
Thank you. And as typical young fashion for the young leaders, great question. So we really appreciate that. Last question from the audience for Paul. You say that Trump's views on international security have not changed since he's a real estate developer in New York. How does Pete Hexet's past as a Fox News host affect how he sees international security in the Asia-Pacific region? Now, since we are running out of time, so while I let my colleagues gather their thoughts to some of those questions that were raised, Let me say, I guess, my little 2 cents on the question regarding security alliances in Southeast Asia. I think certainly the trend of friends with benefits when it comes to defense partnerships is certainly growing. The need to have specific defense provision needs around exercises, education, training, defense industrial based development. These are all things that are certainly more pressing, but at the same time, precisely because of the US-China strategic competition more broadly, the need to be cautious about strategic alignment outside of defense-specific needs are also, I think, in the minds of Southeast Asian policymakers. Now, some have doubled down on its alliances with the United States, and others, more Southeast Asian states, are seeking partnership diversity with new sets of defense partners from South Korea, Japan, Australia, and others. But I think ultimately, the need to have maneuvering space and strategic autonomy will not go away. And so I think in that sense, the need for friends will grow as the anxiety grows, but whether or not that friend will come with specific requirements or commitment is, I think, what many in the region are asking. Let me go to Fanila. Do you have last thoughts on some of the key questions?
Sure, thanks, Evan. I think just in terms of the supply chain security or and general component security of supply as well, and CRM, I think it's something we've looked at in terms of Europe, but also within the European engagement in Asia Pacific, we're seeing it becoming part of a broader part of agreements where it's not just in terms of economics and trade and defense. There is also an element of security of supply in agreements. So I think we'll start to see that become increasingly prevalent as well, where partnerships will widen to try and ensure the security. We did also look at this in terms of how you can support your defense industry and shore up the supply chain, but also look at friendshoring and to kind of build it into the ongoing defense industrial partnerships. But it's definitely a consideration that falls into it because obviously, if you're finding those constraints, then you cannot pursue a program. So that's why the international partnerships that we're seeing are so crucial, because it's the different, not just different expertise, but genuinely the different components that partners can bring into these programs as well. Thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Aprsa, do you want to say something about some of the questions?
Maybe more just on the the role that I think states in this region can play on cyber is not necessarily doesn't necessarily fall into the arms control bucket, but I know that having limitations on the capabilities and what is what can and cannot be targeted. I think that those the region already has pretty strong alliance and communication architectures that can drive some of these conversations, and so I think that there's definitely ample space for the Asia Pacific to really take a strong stance on how it sees conflict in these domains, as opposed to being dictated how conflict has to play out in these spaces. Thanks.
Thank you. Maya?
I guess I could take the last question and maybe touch a little bit on the arms control one before handing over to Paul. But I mean, does China have a role in regional architecture? Sure, it does, and it already plays a role in the regional architecture, doesn't it? I mean, it's not as if there aren't any mechanisms that don't include China. In fact, I can't think of. There are multiple countries in this region that currently engage with China on security and defense, whether in a bilateral or in a multilateral, minilateral format. So I would say China is already part of the regional security architecture. It is included in it. There are just disagreements that are difficult to overcome at the moment, and it would require, I think, a real shift in willingness to find new ways to address some of these grievances and disputes. For there to be substantial progress, and again, time will tell. It's a cop out of an answer, but at the moment it does seem like there might be an opportunity, but we will have to see how that plays out. And then on arms control, should the U.S. and China be discussing this? Absolutely, and of course under Biden they have when it comes to things like the use or application of artificial intelligence when with regards to strategic forces and capabilities. But that being said, I don't think arms control is currently a very popular concept, and I'm not very hopeful that there will be much progress on that in the near term, if I'm realistic.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Paul.
Thanks, Evan. So just ticking down the list of the questions that are out, and Mr. Himroxmi, you mentioned more regional alliances, arms control, as Maya said, how China is placed in the regional security architecture, and there was the question about Hegseth's views before office and now that he's in office. How will that play out? So maybe if I jump in on the question of China's placement in the regional security architecture, I think in some sense, I fully agree with Maya's comments in its presence and importance in the regional security architecture, but you could also make the broader point, not just about security, but about economic and security issues, that China is in some sense well positioned to serve as a regional leader, just as a country that's portraying itself as interested in stability, interested in defending the status quo, whereas the U.S. position right now is that the status quo is insufficient for U.S. interests, and that the U.S. wants to change the way that it approaches the region in many ways, and that that can be a tough sell in Southeast Asia. I think many countries here would say that while the status quo isn't perfect, there are a lot of good aspects to it. I mean, economic growth has been strong, trade has been growing, countries have been benefiting and have some promise of moving from middle income and progressing further. So on the topic of arms control, I agree that while the prospects are poor for making concrete progress in the next few years, I think the view a few years ago was that arms control is pretty much dead, but I think it's looking a lot better than it did then. It's certainly more needed than it ever has been. The sort of Iran nuclear negotiations are underway in a way that was not expected a few years ago, and you can go down the list in terms of the possibilities for at least having talks, even if those talks are not leading anywhere immediately. And then in terms of Hegseth's personal views, that's a question to which I'm very interested in the answer, and I'm hoping to learn more tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Vanilla. And thank you, Pratap. And thank you all for coming to the launch and discussion of the APRSA 2025. Please give our panelists a big round of appreciation. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you more tonight, as well as in the sessions for the next few days. Have a good afternoon.